I needed to build an arched backdrop for our upcoming baby shower. The request was that it be about 7 to 8 foot tall, about 4 foot wide, and made from wood preferably instead of something like foam board like we've used in the past. So I bought a sheet of 1/2 inch sandy plywood from Home Depot and had them cut it in half, giving me 2 4x4 foot pieces. I wanted the backdrop to be foldable for easy transportation to the party, so I had them cut it at the measurement where I wanted it to fold. The first thing that I wanted to do was mark my line for the arch at the top that I would need to cut out. In the past, I've done this by just using a pencil tied to a piece of string, which I'm showing here. I draw a line up the middle, hold down one end of the string, which should be the length of about half the width of the board. In my case, the string was about 2 foot long, and use that to draw the curve like this. The other way, and the one I used for this build, is just by using a scrap piece of wood instead of the string, screwed to the center of the plywood. This would give you more of an accurate and smooth cut because you could lean your cutting tool up against the piece of wood the entire time you do the cut. I wanted to use my jigsaw at first, but when I realized I had lent it to somebody, I had to use my router instead. A jigsaw with a fine finish blade though would be probably easier and less messy if you aren't comfortable with using a router. I made a mistake here and forgot to clamp down the plywood onto my workbench, so as you can see it moved around a bit on me as I was cutting it. After I was done with that though, I made sure to save the top part that I cut off because I wanted to use that for the legs. Next, I laid down both pieces onto some foam insulation board and started to cut and lay out the pieces that I would use to assemble the pockets used to keep the backdrop upright when it stood up. I promise it'll make more sense once it's all put together, but I got this idea from another video I saw, which I'll leave a link to in the description. I used 3/4 inch plywood for these pieces since that's what I had on hand as scrap pieces, and I cut all the pieces just by using a circular saw. I used glue and brad nails to build this part out. I would recommend using a nail length that would go through all 3 layers of plywood. For me, the overall thickness for the 3 layers is about 2 1/4 inches. So using 1 3/4 inch nails would work fine, or even 2-inch nails if you shoot them in at an angle so that they won't come out the front of the backdrop. But if your nails do end up coming out the front though, for whatever reason, that's fine too. What I would do is just hammer them down and apply some wood filler to patch up the area and you should be good. I then started installing 3 door hinges that are going to hold this whole thing up and allow it to fold in half. I used 3/4 inch scrap plywood blocks on each side of the hinge to mount them. I would advise to secure the hinges as best as you can to this part, especially if you're building a tall and heavy backdrop like I am here. Reason being is you don't want these scrap blocks to come apart on you from the backdrop as it's stood up, causing the top half to completely fall off. Don't ask me how I know that. Oh, and I drilled pilot holes for all the hinge screws just so that the plywood wouldn't split. So what I ended up doing was using glue, nails, then attaching the hinges using screws that were long enough to go through both layers of plywood. So the first layer being those small scrap blocks of plywood, and the second layer being the backdrop itself. I just made sure the screws weren't too long, that they would go all the way through and show through the front. I even drove 1-inch screws through the front of the backdrop to better secure these, so I would have screws going in both directions for each hinge. I was really paranoid about it because I didn't want this thing to fall on anybody during our baby shower. For the stand, I cut the leftover piece from the top arch portion in half and used those. I used 3/4 inch scrap blocks of plywood again to attach the hinges to the backdrop, but for attaching the hinges to the legs, I didn't use scrap blocks, I just attached them directly. Alright, just real quick, what I did to keep this thing sturdy and from falling over easily was I cut about a 4-foot long piece of plywood that spans and sits on top of both of these legs. And then on top of that piece of plywood, I put a 20 or 10 pound weight on top just to keep it from tipping over. I rolled on 2 coats of all-in-one paint and primer Behr marquee paint. I had Home Depot match it to the color Soft Chamois by Benjamin Moore. I've seen some people wrap the backdrop in a fabric instead of painting it, so you could do that instead too. Alright, so here's how the backdrop turned out against all the other decorations we had going on. Now you can see why I needed to make this backdrop as tall as I did. We had a plywood Behr that was also around the same dimensions. The seam in the middle where it folds is sort of noticeable if you really look at it, but it wasn't as bad as I thought it would be. Hope you liked the video. Let me know if you have any questions.